Well, thank you very much indeed for coming along to this Taxpayers Alliance discussion. Will net zero punish the poor? As we know, I mean, net zero is a vast challenge for policymakers. It's got some relatively clear indications in terms of the targets and the ambitions that the government wants. I mean, they legislated a few months ago, for example, to have a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions of almost 80% by 2035. Many of the other areas will be fleshed out in COP26 and subsequent bits of legislation, but realistically, what does that mean for individuals, for households, for businesses? What other changes haven't yet been considered? Do we perhaps need to mull over the introduction of a carbon tax and elimination of some existing green levies? Will the hoped for green jobs revolution actually nullify some of the concerns which many workers might well have in terms of their existing jobs might not be around in 10 or 20 years' time, and will the poorest in society actually benefit from quite a few of the changes which the government is planning to introduce in the coming decades? To mull this over, we have a esteemed panel for you today, ladies and gentlemen. I'm joined by Andrea Leadsom. Andrea was the Secretary of State for Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy previously, as well as many other government roles in the past, and Energy Minister for a time as well. Also, I'm joined by Lee Anderson as well. Lee's the MP for Mansfield, elected Ashfield. My apologies. Elected a couple of years ago. I believe was a lifelong Labour Party member who then switched several years back, so here we are. Also joined by Ros Clark as well. Ross is a journalist and author, writes for The Spectator, Telegraph and many other publications, and also joined by Hannah Dillon. Hannah is the head of campaign at Zero Carbon and was previously the director of climate campaigns at Project Everyone. I'll shut up now and pass over to Andrea.
Thank you, Duncan. Well, first thing to say is well done, because I was talking at a net zero panel yesterday with single-use plastic water bottles and plastic cups, and I was like, you have to be the change you want to see, don't you? So, well done. First prize to the Taxpayers Alliance. So the answer to the question, will decarbonisation hurt the poor, should be no. Obviously, that's the answer we want to hear. And in my opinion, it can be no, and there are two reasons. Number one is jobs, because it's going to create lots of jobs. I'll come back to that. And the other one is because the cost of energy, I do believe, will come down radically. And at the moment, we're in a slightly painful transition, but nevertheless, the cost of energy should and will come down, in my view. So first of all, jobs. So for me, as a horrible ex-banker, representing previously, before politics, so the so-called jewel in the crown of the UK economy, 2 million people employed in financial services, that's going to get blasted out the park by the green economy. So at the moment, we've got about 400,000 people employed in the green economy. That, in my view, will rise to 2 to 3 million by 2030. And the beauty of it is, unlike the financial services sector, what you'll see is jobs right across the economy. So from apprenticeships and things like installation of solar panels, insulating homes, green electric charge points for cars, etc. So real technical jobs, good jobs, solid jobs right across the UK, to decarbonising in the industrial clusters in the north of England. Huge opportunities there, as we're already seeing in Teesside, with some of the hydrogen projects and so on, big opportunities. Likewise, in the oil and gas basin, we'll see retraining for people to get well-paid jobs on offshore wind turbines and so on, maintenance and development. And then all the way through to brilliant UK science, where some of the best technologies are being worked on in the United Kingdom. Things like the Faraday Institute looking at second waves of batteries, to all the sort of nuclear work that's going on at Culham, absolutely extraordinary SMRs by the Rolls-Royce Consortium. And so I do believe jobs is a huge positive story, and that will benefit people right across our economy. But secondly, very importantly, is the cost of energy. And as we're seeing, at the moment, the big rise in energy prices in the UK is partly because we've been doing the right thing. We're transitioning away from fossil fuels faster than most. So we have a big reliance, about 20% on average of our energy still comes from ancient nuclear plants. About 30 to 50 percent from gas and, of course, hopefully the rest from renewables. But when the wind doesn't blow and the price of gas hikes, we don't any longer, rightly, turn to coal-fired plants, and that is that painful transition. But as we move further away from fossil fuels and into renewables and other technologies, what I think we need to see is a electricity market reform Mark II, where we actually move to a much better form of local energy generation. So at the moment, if you want to add your solar panels to the grid, you've got a huge queue to actually be able to do that. Why? Because our national grid was built as sort of motorways, not as little country roads. So what we need to move to is a world where we have local generation, people who are, with a small biomass incinerator, with a small wind turbine, and lots of solar panels, able to generate more locally and join to the grid more locally, to use their own power packs and so on. But we also need to see local electricity pricing, so that if you are living in Cornwall and the sun's shining, you ought to be able to get cheaper electricity. And if you're living in Scotland and the wind's blowing, you ought to be able to get cheap electricity. So we need to move away from a national price to a much more local price. So I do see there's huge potential. Those are the directions we need to go in. Jobs and the cost of energy, I think, should be able to fall. But in order to make that happen, what government has to do is not try and stand in the way of businesses and choose which sectors, but actually instead to give hard deadlines. As we did with coal, announcing in 2015 we would take coal off the system by 2025. Well, the job's almost done, and we're only in 2021. With cars, zero emissions from the tailpipe by 2030. Now businesses are thinking how they will do it. And if, in my view, if we do the same with gas-fired boilers on building and home heating, again, businesses will work out a way to do it at a reasonable cost. So government has to set the deadlines, set the roadmap to getting there, and then get out the way so that businesses can use their creativity and entrepreneurship to actually take us on that journey. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you for that. Ross, pass over to you.
Right, okay, yeah. Now, I'm all in favour of cutting carbon emissions, clean energy the lot, maybe even by 2050. I think it's a perfectly reasonable aspiration, with the word aspiration, so long as it's balanced against other objectives of public policy. But there are two strands of this net zero commitment which bother me. Firstly is the legal obligation that it entails, and the commitment to open-ended costs which have come about as a result of the government legally obliging itself to reach net zero by 2050. And secondly, it's the way the burden of that is already falling on the poor and is going to fall on the poor even more so. And I do not think that's been thought through even enough. To take the first of those strands, the 2050 net zero target was nodded through Parliament in the dying days of Theresa May's government on the back of a guesstimate by the Committee on Climate Change that it would cost between 1% and 2% of GDP between now and 2050 to get to net zero, which makes it all sound vaguely affordable, doesn't it? Yet when you dig down into this estimate, you find it relies on all kinds of assumptions about technologies such as green hydrogen production, carbon capture and storage and so on, which have yet to be scaled up, which effectively do not yet exist in commercial form, and which may never do. Now, Andrea has said, set the target and then business will do the rest. But you cannot assume that. US climate envoy John Kerry, who himself hardly a skeptic, recently suggested that half the technology that we require to get to net zero has yet to be invented. Sometimes technology surprises us on the upside, such as with the speed of computing power, but as often as not, it doesn't, it disappoints. So now, if we were having this debate 50 years ago, we'd all be talking about nuclear fusion and how it was going to give us limitless amounts of virtually free energy. Well, here we are, half a century later, we're still waiting. And when you think about how bad government and its associates are at estimating the costs of things we do know how to do, such as HS2, it just baffles me how anybody can take seriously a guesstimate of the cost of what it'll get to net zero when we don't actually know how we're going to do it. We don't know how we're going to decarbonise steel or cement production. And I was looking this morning, as a Swedish company is developing hydrogen, steel production by hydrogen. Great promising technology, fantastic. Let's fund it and try and bring it in Britain rather than Sweden. But, look at their timetable. They're hoping to get the first commercial production in 2026. They're not expecting to be able to decarbonise steel production fully until 2045. There are huge reams of problems that have to be overcome. You've got to decarbonise the steel production itself, and then you've got to decarbonise the hydrogen production as well, which is another great technical challenge. Now, when you make these sort of arguments to enthusiasts for net zero, they tend to resort to generalist arguments. My favourite is when they say, well, it's like John F. Kennedy in 1961 saying the US will put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. We might not know how we're going to do it, but somehow with enough will and hard work, we'll get there. To which I say this: Kennedy he set one specific objective, and he set a large but finite budget to do it. What he didn't do was place a legal obligation on the US government to get to the moon and invite activists to go and sue the government if they failed, which is what is already happening with net zero. You see, every time the government comes up with any infrastructure project, the environmental groups march off to the High Court to say this is not, in keeping with the net zero promise. And they're right, they've already won on the third runway. They will keep winning because, if you say net zero by 2050, it's difficult to see any airport expansion, for example, any steelworks and so on could be consistent with that target. Now, as for the second strand, I'll just go into very quickly. It bothers me how, when it comes to any green issue, the government goes away from progressive taxation and goes automatically towards very regressive means of financing it. We've paid huge subsidies to well-off homeowners to fit biomass boilers, heat pumps and solar panels to their homes. I should know I've got solar panels on my own roof, which are a great subsidy farm for me. Yet most of the cost for that is not coming out of general taxation, which have some progressive element. It's going straight on energy bills. So my neighbours are paying for those. Less well-off neighbours are paying. It's the same with electric cars. Great subsidies for people buying electric cars. But on the other hand, you've got, ultra-low emission zones and so on, which are, put huge charges on people who've got old cars, can't drive into central London, and so on. And it gets worse. Committee on Climate Change has suggested that the sale of rent of homes should be banned from 2028 unless they receive at least a C rating on an energy performance certificate. Now, for 8 million British homes which have solid walls, that's extremely difficult to achieve. Could mean £10,000 or more in solid wall insulation, and even then it might not work. It might cause other problems, damp problems and so on. And, if you were of limited means, you're facing a situation, if the government takes up that recommendation, as it's done with so many other Committee on Climate Change things, that, you might not be able to afford to do up your house. You might not be able to sell it either, and where you end up then, I simply don't know. But I think I may be exceeding my time, so I'll cease there and cease and desist.
Lovely, thank you for that, Ross. Hannah, pass over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So back to the question about whether net zero will punish the poor, our answer to that really is that we've got to make sure that it doesn't. So yes, if we don't factor the distributional impacts of climate mitigation policies into policy development and fiscal design, then net zero could quite possibly punish the poor, but we shouldn't treat that as something that's inevitable, and actually to do so undermines the role that government has to play to step in and make sure that that isn't the case. So from our perspective, it's not about criticising the target. As Ross said, it is now enshrined in law, so it's got to happen. But it's actually about thinking through the policies and fiscal measures that we can use to deliver that target in a way that is fair and equitable, and crucially, from our perspective, enables everyone to not only take part and participate in the net zero transition, but actually benefit from it as well, regardless of their circumstance. And when we talk about circumstance, we're thinking, yes, about socioeconomic background, but also things like where you live in the UK, your physical ability or lack thereof, your ethnicity. There's a whole bunch of things we need to consider in this that aren't necessarily at the forefront of the debate at the moment. So what we want to do is reframe the debate away from one about costs, and just to say, if anyone wants an explanation of that CCC estimate, I divert you to Chris Stark's Twitter feed, where he gives a very long and detailed explanation of how they got to it. But away from costs, because what we understand is that the costs of inaction on climate change far outweigh the costs of investing in the net zero transition now. But actually thinking more about a debate in which we think through how we enable participation in the net zero transition and move away from policies that seek to do no harm towards policy, the use of environmental policy to actively do good. And yes, from kind of a planetary perspective, but also a human health perspective, and critically from a poverty alleviation perspective as well. And so that's how we want to reframe the debate. And what does that actually mean in practice would be a very fair question. At the Zero Carbon Campaign, we've been working with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and IPPR to try and figure some of that out. So we've brought together poverty alleviation groups and green groups kind of in the same room to actually think through what the poverty risks of the net zero transition might be through the decarbonisation of food, transport and heating, identify what those risks are and try and come up with some policy mitigation measures and practical recommendations that can help us address those risks. We by no means have all of the answers, but hopefully this is the start of a really interesting process whereby we all work together to think through these things. We have a report on this if anyone's interested. I'm very happy to make sure it's circulated afterwards, but I'll just share some of the principles that these experts have come up with. So I mentioned assessing and being acutely aware of what the poverty risks are. We know that the Treasury is currently conducting a review into this. Hopefully that will at least start the conversation. And then we need to design policies that seek to actively mitigate those risks, but critically ensure the benefits of the net zero transition, whether that's warmer and more comfortable homes, better air quality, more accessible transport. I could go on, but we need to make sure those benefits accrue to those who need them most. So, for example, the low-income households that Ross has alluded to. We also need to ensure that through the transition we enable people to make choices with dignity. This is super important. This isn't about imposing top-down changes on people and telling them how they have to live their lives. It's actually about things like thinking through when we introduce policies and cost measures so that we can ensure people have low-cost access to low-carbon alternatives in advance of any penalties being introduced for non-compliance. So, for example, I think a key theme of this conference has been the decarbonisation of heat and energy prices. So how do we, rather than tell people to rip out their gas boilers, how do we enable them to do so? How do we provide them with the information they need to understand why that's important, what choices are available to them? For those who can't afford it, how can we give them access to finance that enables them, for example, to install, yes, a heat pump, but also the home insulation they need to ensure they reap the cost benefits of that heat pump in terms of reduced energy bills over time. And the final one, which I've mentioned, but I will reiterate, is around designing policies that enable active participation in the net zero transition. So one of the figures that gets bandied about, and I think it might be a Bayes one, but I might get corrected on that, is that 62% of the emissions reductions required to achieve net zero need to come from some sort of behaviour change. But we can't just expect people to take those changes through small changes in their lifestyles or through massive costs that they need to take on, for example, to install their own electric vehicle charger in their homes. We need to design policies that enable people to make those choices and make those choices the attractive option, both in terms of comfort and quality of life, but also in terms of cost. So that it doesn't necessarily cost people financially, but they can still reap the rewards of the net zero transition and the changes that they're making in their lifestyles in terms of their health, accessibility, living standards, and back to the point about poverty alleviation. And I appreciate that some of this might sound a little bit idealistic, but I think it is really important that we change the way that we're thinking about this so it's not quite so negative and actually focuses on the benefits that this can bring, because as we've said, it's enshrined in law. So what we're advocating for is a holistic approach and a range of measures that can deliver that transition in a way that enables accessibility towards low carbon living, enables participation, which I've mentioned, supports choice with dignity, and maximises access to the rewards that the net zero transition can bring with the right policy making and the right fiscal design. So, yeah, in response to the question, is it going to punish the poor? I think our answer is really, let's make sure that it doesn't.
Grand. Thank you, Hannah, and good plugging of your research as well. And finally, on to Lee.
Yeah, thank you. Will it punish the poor? I think it probably affect all of us, to be honest with you. Short term and long term, that's my honest opinion. But I've been knocking doors and I've been a political activist for the past 20 years for both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. And I can honestly say, in all that time, this never comes up on the doorstep at any stage. People, it's not at the top of their agenda. But if you ask them the honest question, is what government's trying to achieve the right thing, then 90% of people will say, yeah, it is the right thing. What they do actually disagree on is how we pay for it, who should pay for it, and how we should pay for it. That's what people disagree on. And we should be proud of this country, our achievements over the past 30, 40 years. I think in the last 11 years, we've reduced carbon emissions in this country about 28%. That's probably the highest of any G7 country. And we never really shout about that, and we should be incredibly proud. And we've got the lowest emission rate in this country now since the Victorian times. I mean, I remember a time 30, 40, 50 years ago, going to school, all the smoke coming out the chimneys. We had coal fires in Ashfield. All the factories were run on coal heating, the schools, the hospitals, all public buildings were putting all sorts of carbon into the atmosphere. We stopped all that, but we never talk about that, do we? We should be incredibly proud of what we've achieved. And the cost of this, it continues to grow. We never know, right throughout time, all big projects, whether you're going back 300 or 400 years building canals and bridges, to the Channel Tunnel, to railways, every single project we do, the cost, it spirals out of control. So nobody can honestly can honestly say now how much it's going to cost. And that really concerns me. Who pays for it? Does rich people pay for it? Do poor people pay for it? It's all right for people like me. I'm on a good salary. I've got a nice big house. I've got 2 cars. It won't really bother me, will it? I can afford to pay a bit more. I probably will pay a bit more. But, I've been that person in Ashfield. I've been on minimum wage. I've been a single parent. And let me tell you, the difference of 5, 10, 20 quid a week makes a big difference to people in my constituency. So when people say to me, it won't affect the poor, I've been that poor person, so come and have a conversation with me. Boilers, electric cars, who's going to pay for them? That's a big worry. I've already got constituents now telling me about electric cars. Who's going to pay for the electric car? I've looked into buying an electric car. I can't afford one, and I get a decent wage. The price at the moment is astronomical. And when you're not dictating to a country such, but when you're telling people in your country you must go on this journey, which actually I agree with the journey, it's just the way we do it. But when you're telling people that your money, because ultimately everybody's going to pay for it, I'm looking at other things in this country which a taxpayer are already paying for. I'm looking at, for example, HS2, over 100 billion quid. People are pretty fed up with that at the moment. That's a big problem in my patch. It's all pain, no gain. It whizzes by at 120 mile an hour. You can never get on it. You've got to travel 20 or 30 mile to get on HS2. And you know what? The vast majority of people in my constituency never go to London. I'm one of the few that get on that train to come to London every week. Foreign aid. Big problem. That comes up on the doorstep. Foreign aid, 10 billion, I think it is now. People, in Ashfield, I know it's like in your constituencies, they say to me, charity begins at home. There's another 10 billion you could put towards this green journey. NHS, what a waste of money that is in certain departments. We're seeing now we're paying managers 250 grand a year. Absolutely outrageous. We're paying diversity officers 70, 80 grand a year. Absolutely criminal. And we're asking people to put their hand in the pocket to pay more. Let's sort the NHS out. Our asylum system, that's broken. That's costing us hundreds of millions of pounds, if not billions of pounds. We need to put that right. Fortunately, we are getting that right. And my biggest problem at the moment, my big bugbear, is the BBC. We've got a licence fee, 160 quid a week. We're absolutely robbing people, robbing pensioners, the over 75s, to pay this fee, which is actually, for me, the BBC is the official opposition in this country. They're the one organisation that opposes government. We need to sort that out, scrap the BBC, and when you've gone through all these, this is just a waste of money, all these things that I think, well, my residents certainly think this, and at the end of the day, I'm here to represent my residents. Save the money on all these projects, and then come back with your begging bowl and say, you know what, we need a bit of money off you, and then it might be a bit more acceptable. But we have to have an honest conversation about our energy policy in this country, because it's not always been great under both governments. we need to have an honest conversation about fracking. Now, we all want to walk to that switch on or that kettle in the morning and put a kettle on and have a cup of tea. Most people aren't actually bothered where that energy comes from, let's be honest. You just want your cup of tea, you want to put your light on, you want to have a shower, have a bath and go to work. That's what we like. And we're importing lots of gas. It's coming through a pipeline from, I think, Scandinavia. But we're still using gas, and we've got gas in this country underground. So we need to have an honest conversation. Can we frack it safely? Can we frack it cheaply? If we can, why are we transitioning over the next 20, 30, 40 years? Why aren't we using that gas? We've got geothermal energy which we can use, which is mine water. About 25% of this country sits on top of coal mines. I'm an ex-coal miner, so I know a little bit about it, where we can pump warm water out of mine workings into an heat exchange and use that as district heating. That can then go back into the mine and it comes back up. That lasts forever. That's a relatively cheap way of heating a whole community. You can do factories, you can do hospitals, you can do all housing estates. Whitehaven Colliery in Cumbria. This is a coal mine. It's been in the news for ages. This coal mine, for some reason, people in this country are reluctant to accept that this coal mine will actually mine metallurgical coal, which is coal that goes to steelworks. It could go to British Steel. British Steel and other cement factories are currently importing about 3 million tonnes of this coal a year from places like Russia, America and China. And we've got it sat underneath us in the northwest. It's an absolute scandal. We could mine this coal cheaply. It could be safely, it could be more carbon friendly on our doorstep and send it to places in the UK to make British steel, which, you know, the ironic part about the steel, we can use that to make wind farms. It's absolutely nuts. Why aren't we doing this? And I hope this coal mine does open and we can show a little bit of sense in this country, because I think we're far too keen to try and race to the top and try and be the world leaders. Nothing wrong with being world leaders, because eventually we will make, you know, we'll get it back. But let's have some common sense. You know, let's put our own country first. Let's not penalise the poor, because ultimately the people in Ashfield, where I represent, they're not that well off. You know, the living wage, the minimum wage, they're not wealthy. We can still buy a house in Ashfield for 80 and 90 grand. And it's all right for people in this room and on this bench and in that building there dictating to my residents that you'll be able to afford it. And quite frankly, I say no, they can't afford it. You know, it's your job as government and our job as politicians to come up with a much better idea than putting fuel bills up. That's the easy way out, putting fuel bills up. It's the easy way, putting levies on. Be a bit more creative, come back with a better package, and then I'll agree to it. And that's me done.
Lovely. Well, thank you for that, Lee. I didn't necessarily expect a discussion about the BBC. I think that was well received. We do have a couple of mics going around. I would just say, make sure that the mics will come to you before you start speaking, so we can all hear your question. Gentlemen, just in the middle of that.
Hi, it's Alex. I'm a risk analyst. I was listening earlier to the and I think the sort of green utopia that people market is a bit ridiculous. And I was kind of interested in what evidence people have about how energy prices are going to come down and how this cottage industry of energy generation is going to result in things being cheaper. As last time I checked, we're a massive net importer of energy, and global energy usage is exponentially increasing. And when has, in the history of humankind, have cottage industries ever been more cost efficient than centralised industry?
Thank you for that. Ross, would you like to start with energy?
Yeah,
energy
well,
costs?
it seems to me that the whole basis of industrialisation, go back 200 years, people lived life expectancy 40, 50 years, now we live 80, 90 years. This is this incredible increase in living standards over 2 centuries. It all really comes down to one thing, which is cheap energy. And to sort of think we can suddenly, you know, thrive without cheap energy seems to me to be, weird. You know, I appreciate that there are forms of renewable energy which are now quite cheap. To put up a wind turbine, it can now be done at relatively low cost. The per kilowatt hour cost is low, but you cannot take a wind turbine or a solar farm on its own and say that is an energy source for the country because, of course, of the intermittency problem. And, you know, for years and years, we've been just putting up more and more of these wind farms, solar farms, without ever solving the underlying problem of how do you store energy for, you know, for a non-windy and non-sunny day. And it seems to me that at the moment it's all based on paying owners of wind farms to turn their generators off when it's too windy. And so it's actually putting in more cost there. And, you know, and I say until we can solve that problem, do we have massive batteries? I mean, the battery emplacements at the moment, which, I mean, the one that Tesla have put in Australia, it sort of smooths out. It will store the amount of energy that's generated by one wind farm for a few hours. And that's just this huge, great installation in Australia. It's unlikely to me that battery technology is ever going to get to a stage where it can store energy from 1 week to another, from 1 month to another. Can we do it by pump storage systems? Can we do it by hydrogen, you know, generating hydrogen, producing hydrogen when it's windy and then burning it when it's not windy? I mean, possibly, but I say until we solve that problem, more wind farms, more solar farms are going to cause a lot of problem.
Andrew, you want to?
Thanks. Yeah, I take issue with your point about cottage industries. Not cottage industries at all. Actually, that's to misunderstand how we use energy now. So, as I say, 20 to 30% is still old nuclear. We're trying to build new nuclear. We've not talked about that yet. Very expensive, but baseload, very important for the UK. Offshore wind, now it's cheaper now to build a renewable project to generate the same wattage as an old fossil fuel project. It is cheaper to build the renewable project. The issue of intermittency is absolutely right, but at the same time, the project in Teesside is going to electrolyse, creating hydrogen and actually then producing the opportunity, not yet proven, but producing the opportunity to use hydrogen in the gas network, which would be an absolutely radical switch on of a alternative technology. These aren't cottage industries. And actually, if you look at offshore wind, when I was Energy Minister back in 2015 and we did the first CFDs, it was costing £150 per megawatt hour of offshore wind electricity. It's now under £50 per megawatt hour. So the economies of scale are absolutely huge. This is not a cottage industry. Local pricing makes a lot of sense precisely because wind is one energy source, solar is another energy source. Ultimately, if you're not prepared to take that journey and you're not prepared to let businesses be the creators and the entrepreneurs and the innovators, as they have been throughout history, from the days of coaches and horses to the internal combustion engine to the Industrial Revolution, if you're not prepared to take that journey, then we are stuck with old coal, which is what's happening in Germany. They turned their back on nuclear after Fukushima, and so now they're opening new coal-powered plants. Absolutely ridiculous. So unless you are completely going to say climate change isn't a thing and let's just carry on with coal-fired power plants, which will, by the way, now cost you more than an offshore wind farm, then I just think it's the most ludicrous debate that we're having. You know, and actually the issue that we really need to focus on is the 3.1 million households in fuel poverty in this country. That's where the focus needs to be, and not, by the way, on giving them money to pay for their extra energy bills, but on insulating their homes, on giving them heat pumps. I completely agree with Hannah. I find myself extraordinarily. But, you know, the fact is we need to focus on targeted support to keep people warmer with lower electricity bills, rather than just be in denial and saying, well, the technologies don't exist. They do exist. They just do. And businesses are going to make them happen.
Actually take some pride in being accused of marketing a green utopia. I think that we're not focusing enough on the other side of the coin, which are the kind of impacts that we're seeing on a daily basis of climate change and ecological breakdown, which are affecting real people in real time in their lives. We're seeing flooding that is killing people. We've seen a little girl who's had air pollution put as the cause of death on her birth certificate because she lives close to the South Circular and it exacerbated her asthma. We're seeing unbelievable levels of river pollution. We're seeing farmers unable to produce the crops that people are demanding that they do because of changes in weather patterns. So, I mean, I'm far from being kind of an aggressively activist green, but I think that we can't just, as Andrew's just saying, we can't ignore these things. So what we have to do is find ways to mitigate them so that people's lives aren't being ruined by the effects of climate change. And absolutely, we shouldn't pretend that these things are just going to magically happen and energy bills are going to come down. The point that we're making is we've now got this target, so we need to find ways to deliver it rather than just saying it's going to happen by 2050. Let's find ways to make sure that it does in a way that is fair and equitable. And just a quick note on jobs as well. There's a lot of talk of green jobs and jobs of the future. Again, we need to put the processes in place to make sure that those jobs can be created. There's a big skills gap that we need to address, but there's also a huge opportunity to provide long-term stable jobs for people who, yes, may used to have worked in coal mines, but maybe there's opportunities in, you mentioned the production of low-carbon steel, Lee. Of course, we need to find ways to incentivize investment in that to make sure that it happens, but there's a lot of opportunities here as well.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try and answer your question. Just a couple of points, though. The way to get cheaper energy is to produce more fuel, and that's gas, oil, whether it's wind, solar, wave, or nuclear. But there has been a big push in this country over the past 20-odd years on wind and solar and wave. Has it made your bills cheaper? Has it made your energy bills cheaper? I don't feel like it has. I mean, I could be wrong. But it doesn't feel like our bills are coming down in this push. Now, nobody disagrees with the argument about the journey we're about to embark on. We all want to get there eventually. But the thing is for me, we need to make sure it's fair. And if we're going to shoulder the burden, we must make sure that we transition in a way that's fair to all of us, just not a few of us. And the jobs thing is very important, the green jobs. I'm all for that. But the argument doesn't carry much weight at the moment. The time that will actually carry weight, the green jobs, is in 20 or 30 years' time, when dads and sons and daughters and mums are working in this industry, like the industry that I worked in many, many years ago. When people can see a direct threat to the jobs and their livelihoods in their own area, then they'll say, you know what, this is a great thing.
Lovely, thanks. Another round of questions. Gentleman at the front.
Thank you. So my name is Councillor Tim Briggs. I'm the only Conservative councillor in Lambeth, in the centre of London. And Lambeth Council has embarked on a climate action plan, as have Wandsworth Council, Conservative Wandsworth Council, spent lots of money on it. My concern is that as we reach these deadlines, we're going to get to a point where we haven't achieved everything we want to achieve in terms of meeting those deadlines. And the government will then just give more powers to local authorities to implement local initiatives. And what we've seen in London are, net zero, environmental initiatives, including things like low traffic neighbourhoods, which just increase traffic gridlock and pollution. When you give one-party state London local Labour authorities the power to implement whatever they want, they'll just put a green tag on it and do whatever they feel like. So what worries me is that we'll get to a point where local authorities will be asked to shoulder the policy burden in implementing these policies, and we'll get a mess, more of a mess than we have in London at the moment, which is a mess anyway.
Well, congratulations on being the only one. That's and good luck in finding some more colleagues to join you. It's a really good point you make, and actually, really, that's my whole thesis, is government needs to set hard deadlines and a roadmap and then get out the way. And I completely agree with you. If it's left to overzealous individual, often very left-wing boroughs who don't give a stuff about people's individual liberties, they will actually take liberties with your liberty and start shutting things down that make no sense. So actually, setting deadlines, using the example again of 2030 for zero emissions from the tailpipe for cars, that is a hard deadline now that all of the car manufacturers are finding a way to meet. And as a result of that, the costs of electric cars will come down. And I gave you the example of offshore wind turbines. That is how we will meet it. There will be a secondary market for electric cars. They are expensive right now. There are issues with range anxiety and so on. But this is the transition, and they will become cheaper. But what government mustn't do is micromanage, and by that means whether it's picking technologies, whether it's giving local authorities loads of powers to make people's lives miserable and so on. Government should really set the framework and then the roadmap, so that sort of incremental, each year you should be producing 5% more zero emissions vehicles, so that it doesn't become a sort of big bang in 2030, and then let businesses do the rest. Businesses, and we as Conservatives, we believe in enterprise and the creativity of entrepreneurs, and we see it time and time again, the economies of scale that come from the proper rollout of a new technology, and I think that's what we should be doing.
About 20 years ago, the then editor of The Spectator, one Boris Johnson, asked me to write a piece about the perverse outcomes of Tony Blair's obsession with targets. And my favourite example was of a hospital which, they couldn't have people in A&E for more than 4 hours. So what the hospital did was it redesignated a corridor as a clinical assessment unit, and then magic, nobody waited in A&E waiting room for more than 4 hours. But I now see the same huge potential for perverse outcomes from the net zero target as we did with Blair's sort of targets. And it particularly bothered me. You mentioned the example of local authorities that could sort of use this as an excuse to take our liberties, do anything they like, exert their own agendas. But the sort of bigger picture of the industrial picture, what I can see happening. What I think a lot of people don't understand is this net zero target only refers to territorial emissions that are carbon spewed out within the confines of the United Kingdom. It doesn't include carbon embedded in goods, food, and anything that's imported to Britain. So, you work through the consequences and you think, well, look, we could meet this target by 2050 and we'll all boast about it, and find actually what's happened is we've just exported our food production, we've exported our remaining heavy industry. And you look at China's 5-year plan. China is actually more committed to reducing carbon emissions than people give it credit to, or certainly on the surface. And it's actually mentioned in the 5-year plan. And it sets a target, we will reduce carbon emissions by so much per unit of GDP. They're allowing for economic growth. And you come back, we're going to impose this target on ourselves, but China's not going to paint itself into a corner in the way we have. And I don't think Biden and the US are going to do it as well. And I don't think many countries are going to be as foolish to tie themselves down in this way. And it's these perverse outcomes that we're going to have to be very beware of.
That actually isn't fair, Ross. As you know, the UK is not exporting its emissions, and we are setting targets for shipping and aviation. We're at the forefront of the jet fuels for new wave of electric aircraft, etc. So that's simply not true to say that the UK is just going to export its emissions. And also, actually, to say that we're just going to let them do all the heavy industry. I mean, as Business Secretary, I literally worked my butt off to save British Steel in the UK, bought by a Chinese company, operated in Scunthorpe, because we want to keep UK manufacturing and expand it. That's what we're doing in the green sector. There's a new turbine factory, I believe, just opening in Teesside, or blade factory just opening in Teesside. So UK manufacturing in the green economy. It's really important, I think, to give people the facts.
Hannah.
Yeah, just to say, absolutely take the point on local councils. I think there is also a role for local authorities to play, because the way that the benefits and the risks in net zero manifest is different in different places. So the ECIU did a report looking at job opportunities, and for example, if you think of Blackpool, that is somewhere where 3/4 of homes are below EPC band C, but they've also got unemployment rates that are higher than the national average at 11%, so there is a clear opportunity to create jobs in home retrofits there. And then just on the point about consumption emissions or emissions that are produced abroad as a result of our domestic demand, but then attributed to other countries' carbon emissions kind of numbers, I absolutely agree it's something that we need to take more responsibility for. There's a lot, and maybe you see this on the doorstep as well, there's a lot of why should we act on our emissions if China aren't doing anything? Well, a lot of that is partly as a result of our demand, so we need to start to factor that into the way that we address this challenge as well. The point that Andrew just raised about us factoring in emissions from our share of aviation and shipping into the 6th carbon budget is a really good start, but there's a lot more that we need to do to account for the fact that we are fueling the production of emissions abroad as a result of British demand.
Yeah, thank you. Just to come back, well done, by the way, on your current role. And I speak as an ex-Labour councillor on a Labour-controlled council, and I can tell you firsthand that they're not bothered if they waste your money or not. It's not their money, that's how they look at it. And they're not bothered if they are acting awkward or try and block a government like a national policy, and which is why we need a national policy with clear deadlines and clear guidelines, and it needs to be fair so the whole country can go on the journey together, not just parts of the country. We need to do it together and all shoulder the burden, if you like. Like I say, it has to be fair. Andrew's quite right. A business eventually will sort it out. They always do. You know, they are the backbone of the country. But we all need to play our part nationally. It's a little bit unfair at the moment when you look at the rest of the world how we're going on this green journey. You've got places like China and Canada and other countries that seem to get away with everything, and we're trying to lead the world. That's fine. I think eventually, you know, down the line, 20 years, that will probably pay off for us. But nationally, at the moment, we have to realise it's a national. It will be a national problem, a national journey, not just a local one. And areas like yours where you've got an awkward local council and they need to be sorted out. And my solution to that is unit. Yeah, throw them out, vote them out.
Thank you for that. The question, chap at the back said this up for a while.
Thank you. John Stanley from the Workington constituency up in Cumbria, not far from where the coal mine is to be hopefully opened. I don't need to be convinced that we've got a problem over the climate, you know, and I believe we do need to do something about it. But I've for 25 years now worked in the property construction industry, property management around the northwest of England, and I've been involved with many hundred projects involving solar, biomass boilers, lots of heat pumps recently, etc. We had a big rollout in the early 2000s when we upgraded many of the boilers in the old houses to so-called new super efficient boilers. However, I'm becoming very disillusioned from the practical point of view with these things. We did the maths very, very carefully on the new boilers that were introduced in the year 2000, and I can say with absolute 100% certainty, all these new boilers are worse for the environment than the old ones were, because they don't work. They last 5 to 10 years instead of 30 or 40 years like the old ones used to do. Yes, in a laboratory, when you put them on the wall and plug them in, yes, they're 90% efficient, but in the real world, that's not how they work. You know, cars don't do 60 miles to the gallon, they do 45. Right? You know, LED lighting, it's rubbish. You know, you try buying a new LED light these days that doesn't have a built-in LED light bulb, so that when it goes, you have to change the whole fitting. You know, I've been arguing with the suppliers of these for many years now. You know, the practicality, you know, heat pumps. You know, they're nothing like as efficient as people say. They are very problematical. They're noisy. They break down. You know, we've fitted 9 in the last 5 years at our properties, and you know, we've not had a single one that hasn't had a major fault with it already. You know, so you know, until you get the practicalities of these things right, putting into law a requirement to do something without having first done the work to make sure that these things work in the real world, because you've got to look at the whole of life cost of these things, the cost of making them, the cost of installing them, the cost of running them, how long do they last, how much work is required to maintain them and look after them, what do you do with them when you finish with them, taking them away and recycling them. Now, until you look at these things in a proper hard way, you know, it's going to cause a major problem. Now, most people have done all the easy things so far. they've stuck a bit of loft insulation in, they've replaced the windows, put some double glazing in. You know, those who can afford it have got themselves an electric car. But it's nothing. We've gone nowhere yet. And the problem is these things don't work. You know, we've not done anything to remove the barriers. You know, try connecting to the grid anywhere. Look at the cost of that. You know, we've got a bill last week for £120,000 to put some electric car charging point in one of our campsites up in Cumbria. Again, enormous amount of money to do a job that should have been 20 grand.
Right,
And these are the sorts of things now, and I've heard nothing from the government or anybody else about tackling these problems. You know, they say, you know, I don't know how many of you have got a heat pump at your place, but put one in and see what your actual bills are after 5 years and how much it costs to maintain it, and then come back and tell us. Because one thing I guarantee, in another 20 years' time, there'll be people ringing you up all the time saying, were you missold a heat pump? Were you told that this would save your bills?
Perfect.
Right? You know, I recommend buying shares in legal companies in about 10 years' time because they'll be making a fortune out of it.
I think we get the point there. Thank you very much for that. Costs, many costs. Andrew.
Well, yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, therein is the yin and the yang of business, isn't it? Business is creative, but business is also abusive, and we've seen it time and time again with faulty products and so on. But again, I mean, to Ross's point about targets are not the same as deadlines. Deadlines set by government and then businesses figuring out a way to do it. But you are exactly right. The businesses figuring out a way to do it then need to be properly managed and checked. There need to be, I mean, one of the biggest problems I have as a constituency MP is with all of the sort of trade style of enforcement. So people getting ripped off with double glazing that doesn't work or that's half installed, people getting ripped off by buying something that doesn't work and they can't send it back. Yeah, no, I completely agree. Yeah, no, that's all right. No, I'm agreeing with you.
Point, so
Sir, I'm agreeing with you. Absolutely, enforcement is key. Completely agree.
Hannah, anything else?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point that if you're going to ask people to make changes, particularly in their homes, which is very disruptive to lifestyles, we have to make sure that those changes bring benefits rather than cause concern and stress and disruption. I think it's a really key point.
Yeah.
Ross?
Yeah, no, well, the gentleman from Workington makes a very good point, and I'll throw one other thing into the pot, is energy performance certificates, which seem to be being based, you know, a lot of the decarbonisation of housing. It seemed to me a complete joke. I had 2 of these things done on my house, a year apart. The first one gave me a score of 42. I then upped the insulation, I changed it, upgraded the double glazing and several other things and put in the solar panels maybe. I did it again and it gave me a score of 32. And because these things, they're not real. I mean, they pretend to be measuring your sort of energy consumption, but they're really just a sort of guess by, you know, the sort of surveyor guesses the thickness of your walls, guesses what's upstairs and fits into a model in his computer. And they're complete fiction, and they underestimate the energy consumption in new houses, and they overestimate the energy consumption of old houses in many cases. And and as you say, you know, whenever anything green initiative is announced by government, the cowboys start rubbing their hands with glee. I think it's something we've got to be very, very wary about, not just leave it to business, as some people say.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, a real man from the real world, so that's interesting. And my colleague here, Ross, is quite right about the cowboys as well, because not only will the solicitors be making a packet, there are unfortunately some unscrupulous people out there who will make a packet working on this green agenda. And we've seen it with the thermal cladding in Ashfield. These companies just popping up every 10 minutes. They were taking the grants, thousands and thousands of pounds off of energy companies, rocking up to a terraced estate and cladding about 100 terraced houses. Thank you very much, a couple of grand in pocket. And then 6 months later, all the cladding was dropping off. And these people were left with substandard work, in a mess, and could not sell their properties. So I think, you know, as well as all the rules and regulations, we need to make sure that these companies that are going to make, handsome profit out of these projects, we need to make sure that they're regulated properly, and these cowboys aren't allowed to trade like they have done in the past.
Thank you for that. Time for another question. Please, here at the front, just pass the mic over.
Hello. I work for a company in Northamptonshire, actually, and we make reusable nappies for babies. They actually save people money over the course of like a child being in nappies, but they're a very expensive thing to buy up front. And one of the issues that we found, and I'm sure it's the same for electric cars and for things on your house, is that people who are on lower incomes have not got the access to affordable credit or affordable finance for items which are green. And how can we, and I'm sure there's various sort of expertise levels on the panel, how can we give people the access to be able to say, actually I want to buy a more efficient car but I can only afford one that cost me 600 quid off Facebook, or how can I afford to buy a £200 set of reusable nappies? How can I afford that when I haven't got, it's not only just the cost having to come down, it's the access to that credit to be able to afford, it's the upfront affordability.
Thank you for that. Hannah, do you want to make a start? Green credit.
Yeah, again, a really, really important point, and I think it was quite striking yesterday that in the Chancellor's speech there was very little mention of kind of climate change and green policies, and at some point we need to put, or the government needs to put money where their mouth is in relation to the net zero target and actually start delivering sort of finance packages that can enable more people to take part in the transition and can give people the ability to access low carbon lifestyles, because at the moment it's essentially a bit of a kind of middle class privilege to be able to afford to take any action on climate change, and that's why we're seeing this debate pan out where you keep getting told you can't be a climate activist unless you've installed a heat pump, which kind of essentially makes the problem even worse because only people with enough money to buy a heat pump are then allowed to be a climate activist. So absolutely agree, we need to think about that. We also need to think about people in rented accommodation, because what incentives do landlords have at the moment to green homes and help bring down the bills for people living in them? Same with social housing. There's a whole bunch of concerns around this that aren't, I'm sure are being actively considered in government, but no policies seemingly rolled out at the moment. And back to kind of the point that was raised earlier, when we're rolling out these programs, we need to make sure they work. So financing for green homes upgrades that was then pulled kind of puts people off a bit as well. So it's really important that we consider giving people packages that give them access to green lifestyle choices. For example, when it was mentioned earlier in terms of the cost of installing chargers for electric vehicles, well, how are we going to help finance those? Because when we've done poll it, we do a huge amount of opinion research, and when we've done it on this, cost is the main. I mean, I know people say things in polls that they kind of want to be heard, but there's a lot of appetite to take part in the transition. It's just that cost is often a barrier, and there was some polling recently done around this, and I think 70% of respondents said that they would want to be given money to make changes in their homes in line with the government's net zero targets as well.
I think the answer would be 70% of people would like to be given money, full stop. But
Great.
I mean, actually, to your point, transition to green needs to be hassle-free for people. And actually, reusable nappies, that's a whole different issue, isn't it? Because it's not just about being green and being affordable, it's also about being convenient. And so a lot of parents will say, well, I'm not doing that because that means I have to wash the nappies. So I think there's a different issue there. So I think the challenge for you, yes, okay, so we can have that discussion probably separately. But I think the issue is actually for green transition, it has to make sense to people. So for example, smart meters, oh my goodness, from 2015 to 2019 as Energy Secretary and then as Business Secretary, people didn't want to let you in to fit a smart meter because they couldn't see the point of it. What's the use of it? Hence, if you had local pricing, that would make sense, because then you could sort of see, well, it would be almost free to do my weekly wash right now. And actually, people didn't get that. And that's because it was a hassle. So I actually do think in all of this green transition, it has to be made easy for people. So again, I would say, businesses need to be creative. They need to make it. I mean, you could obviously have a credit scheme. You could sort of say, it's £3 a week and that's how it works, or £10 a week or whatever, and you do it interest, zero interest free, and do it that way, and then it is affordable for people if the internal cost is the same as disposable nappies, but it's also got to appeal to them. So it's got to compete with the convenience of just binning all of the baby's nappies. So I mean, there's different factors here. It's exactly right. There's the focus on affordability, but there needs to be a big focus on convenience for people. And in my view, there needs to be a focus on creativity. And as that gentleman said, it's got to also be enforcement. So on a transition, there's loads of aspects to it. No one's undermining or belittling how big and complicated it is. But actually, when you look at it, you know, we've reduced our carbon emissions by over 50% now since 1990, and we've grown our economy by over 80% since 1990. So at an aggregate level, the fact that, oh, it'll cost us and we'll all die if we have to decarbonise, that is blatantly not the case. And then if you look at the green economy, it is forecast to grow by 11% over the next few years, way more than the normal economy. So there's actually huge advantages from an economic perspective, big picture, in this transition to green. But it is complicated, and I think that's your example is a really good example of some of the challenges for businesses and for government.
Great. Well, thank you for that. I'm afraid we've run out of time. I don't think we've fully answered the question. I think there's quite divergent views there on the panel, but I certainly enjoyed that. So let's just thank the panel in the usual way.